What's up? Christian Igwe here, and I serve as the lead pastor of Redeemed Christian Church. Our purpose as a church is to create environments where people are welcomed, known, loved, and get to go to the next step of being grown in Christ. Today, we're going to talk about change and if change is even remotely possible in our lives. And I don't know about you, but change has been a recurring hard thing in my life. It has never been an easy path, and it is something that has to be done intentionally and consistently. And at the beginning of every year, right? It's New Year's. And at the beginning of every year, we have this thought process that says, I am going to make a resolution for this year. And we get into this thought process of this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to hit the gym every day. I'm going to be nicer to people, be kinder, be more generous with my money. We make all of these thoughts for change. But in reality, by March, most of the time that change just fizzles out. And so that leads me to this question of, is it even possible to have lasting change? And I believe it is, and we're going to discuss that as we go through today's video of how God has allowed change in our lives and what that really looks like. Because we know that change is hard. I mean, when it's simple things like light bulb, whatever. I mean, I'm a guy, right? So it's easy in my head. Oh, it's broke. There's a light out. Gotta go fix it. Get it done. Get it changed. But when it comes to our own personal life, it's so much harder, so much more complicated, so messy. And that's because change takes being intentional. And so that's what we're going to go in today. I've heard it said before from a friend of mine who was a pastor, is that a lot of us get into this place where we're like, I don't even want to change. Like, this is just who I am. I'm going to be this way. I was born this way. This is just who I am. And those who are around me, they just need to deal with me, love me as I am. And don't feel guilty for being there. I've said the same thing myself. And I'm sure many of you listening today have said this exact same process of this is just who I am, right? Just deal with it. But this pastor friend of mine, he was saying that, like, if you've ever had that thought in your mindset, you have to realize what you're doing to yourself when you say things like this. And what you're doing is you're letting your own pride stand in the way of your growth. You're self-destructing yourself, and you're not really loving others well to your best of your ability, not living to your full potential, and settling for the minimum existence in your life, burying your overall purpose and potential. I see nobody wants any of those labels on themselves. Nobody wants that. And I don't think any of us do this on purpose, because change is hard, but change is also incredibly vital. For me, I had to make a change in my own life at one point when I was a teenager. And of course, like most teenagers, I was just dumb, right? And I had a lot of pain in my life, and I had a lot of hard moments that I just was refusing to deal with. And during my teen years, I made dumb mistakes. So many dumb mistakes that it had me living a life and identity that wasn't really who I was. And yet, I would have been the first person to say during that time, well, this is just who I am. Y'all got to deal with it. But in reality, that wasn't who I was. That was a reflection of anger, of pain, of all of these things. So I had to learn to change into who I really was. And that's a hard concept to think of, right? I had so many different ups and downs during that time. I was adopted at an early age, and those of you who have been adopted and understand the mindset, the process that goes through your mind, is it's a lot on your chest, especially as a teen, to think of, well, I'm with a family that loves me, but where's my original family? And the thought process and the back and forth had me like lost, right? And then my parents got divorced. I had a girlfriend at the time, and we were just totally toxic for each other. We were not the right people for each other. And I made dumb decisions that led me into one of the worst places in my life, in a jail cell. And after I spent some time paying for a whole bunch of bad decisions, I decided that I wanted to let go of all of this anger, this rage, this regret, this sadness in my life, and become something different. I didn't know how I could achieve that at all. I was like, how do I even start to walk down this path? I thought it was completely impossible, and almost wanted to dive into the process of, well, this is just who I am, this is who I'm always going to be, and just stay there. But I had heard somewhere this quote that said, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. See, I was at that point in my life where staying the same was no longer comfortable. It wasn't comfortable for me. It wasn't comfortable for those around me. Staying the same had to change. I had to change because it was so uncomfortable for me. And this process, this phrase became a mantra for me in my life. And even still, I didn't know how I would, what was the process to do? I didn't know how I would go about changing. And I want to tell you guys that this process is very much so possible, but it takes intentionality. And we can see an example of two major figures of change in the Bible that I'm going to talk about today. And the first one is about King Saul. And we see that out of 1 Samuel. Pretty much you can read throughout the entire book of 1 and 2 Samuel and see kind of Saul's ups and downs and where he came from. But Saul was a man who could not change. He was so attached to the way things were, the way he was. He was like, this is who I am. I'm not going to be anything else. Saul could not change. And he was consumed by his jealousy and his anger towards David. You know, God had installed Saul as the ruler of Israel. And then as David was a baby, and most of us know this story, but as David was a young kid, he had Jesse go out there. God had Jesse go out there and pick David to be the next ruler of Israel. And so Saul's sitting up here like, who's this little shepherd boy who's supposed to be the next ruler? And then we know David goes on to kill Goliath, and it just inflamed Saul's like ego, man. He just saw it and he's like, this guy has got to go. And we watch as Saul just gets consumed by his anger and his bitterness towards David in this next stage of his life. And yet Saul was given opportunity after opportunity to change. We know in verses 9 through 19, if we're looking at 1 Samuel 18, that in verses 9 through 19, Saul was given opportunity after opportunity to change, and David was actually married into Saul's family. David became Saul's son-in-law, and Saul even saw that the Lord was with David. And we see that in verses 28 through 29. It says, when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, his daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David, and Saul became David's constant enemy. Now, think about this, right? Saul had this young ward, this David, who he literally has watched him come up from a kid, be pronounced as a ruler over Israel, and has watched David grow up. So David gets married into Saul's family, and Saul, instead of, as he sees that God is with David, instead of rejoicing in this fact, Saul stepped into hater mode and decided that he was just going to be even more critical, even more enraged at David. And it tells us that Saul became David's constant enemy. And this bitterness, this rivalry, it just didn't stop because Saul couldn't change. He was stuck where he was. He was stuck with, I am the ruler. I am the big man on campus. I can't have anyone else come up in here and destroy what I have created. Not realizing like you didn't create anything. It was God who created it, and you were just the vessel in that situation. But he couldn't even see any of that because he was so distracted with bitterness, jealousy, and just hatred for David. And this is what happens where we become comfortable with where we are. This is what happens when we say, well, this is just who I am. And when we become unwilling to accept change around us. When change happens around us, it can be easy for us to desperately try to cling to what we know, and we can become hardened and bitter at anything that's happening around us. I can remember being on that edge of change myself and realizing the cost of my own personal change. It would cost a way of living that I was comfortable with. I couldn't see another path forward. And I spoke earlier of how the pain of staying the same caused me to change. And it really was just the pain of the things that were happening to me because of who I was. In my own inner being, I was like, well, I'm just going to be this. It's easy to be, bad. It's easy to make stupid decisions. It's hard to make good ones. It's hard to make the right decisions when it's easier to just do something dumb. And this is why it's important for each and every one of us to remember we have to follow the Spirit's lead in our life and allow God to be the instrument of our change. Because if it were up to us, we either wouldn't change or we wouldn't complete the change in our own life. And so we know that it is possible to change. Not if we act like Saul, but it is possible. And we see that in David's story. Now we know this about David, is that David had an excellent start. God really just set David up for success. And David, being a human, did what a lot of us human beings do. He started screwing up, started making mistakes. He started getting prideful, arrogant, thinking he could do just whatever he wanted. But David is a great example of what real lasting change looks like. Change does not make you perfect. And we know that David was not a perfect dude. But he changed his heart. He created a heart change. And David had a relationship with God like no one else. Even when King Saul was incredibly jealous and bitter towards David, chasing him around the entire country out of fear that David would take over his kingship before it was his time, David still chose to go to God in the midst of all of this pain and all of this hardship. And once David became king, he still prayed to God when he was celebrating victories, when he was mad about, relationships that went bad, when he was hurt, when he was betrayed, and when David did dumb things. He admitted his mistakes, he asked for forgiveness, and he sought after God with all of his hearts. Many of the Psalms in the Bible, they come from these prayers from David. And there are some Psalms, man, you'll see David where he's just in this deep, dark place of despair, thinking like he can't dig himself out of that. And this is the kind of intimate relationship that David had with God that made God call David a man after his own heart. Not because David was perfect, but because whether David was on top of the world or on the bottom of the world, David sought God. He chased after God's heart with everything that he had inside him. And this is where I wanted to be personally when I faced my greatest change in my life. I wanted to change to be a man after God's own heart. But I had the wrong ideas about all this because, again, try to add my own human thoughts of how to change into this process. And I thought, okay, if I want to change my life, I got to be perfect. Everything I do has to be perfect. I have to make the right decisions. I have to never make a mistake. And so I got into this process of change, and anytime I'd make a mistake, I'd start beating up myself. I'd start feeling like, okay, well, it's not worth it. I'm never going to change. I'm always going to be like this. And diving into that little circle of really just depression and despair. And David is a great example of that. David has gone into that exact same spiral of depression and despair. You know, at one time, even asking God, like, why, oh God, is my soul so downcast? Like, just wondering why he's so sad and depressed. And because David thought, like I thought, is this change can be done by man's hands, but it can't. In order for us to change, it's not about changing into this perfect being or creature. Look, Jesus was the perfect one, right? So none of us are ever going to ever reach that level. And if we were, then we should just be Jesus. But we know that that's so far from the truth. We will never be Jesus. We will never be perfect. And that's not what God is asking for us. All that God has been asking for us is to be like David and to seek after the heart of God with all of who we are, with all of our heart, with all of our soul and our mind, to seek after God, seek after a relationship with God. And that's what God is asking for us. There's a song out of this new Disney movie called Encanto, and talks about pressure, right? And throughout this whole movie, the oldest sister is kind of like, she's like secondary like parent in the house, and she's like required to have she's required to take care of her siblings, of her brothers, of her sisters, aunts, and uncles. She's required to basically hold the weight of the entire family on her shoulders, so much so that when she starts to lose her strength, she loses just her very identity. And because she thought she had to be perfect. And this is the thing that God is telling us, is like, we don't have to be perfect, right? There's a lot of pressure in our lives to be perfect, whether it's from our family members, whether it's from our own internal thought processes that tell us, okay, I need to be perfect. I need to make sure that everything, like I did, like everything is perfect. No, make no mistakes, do nothing wrong. But God doesn't want you to be perfect. He just wants you to literally be perfectly you. And that's with all the mistakes, all of the good, bad, and ugly. He just wants you to be you and to seek after his heart. So today I want to close with this. I want to challenge you to commit to change, and not change for other people, not change for anyone else, but change for you. And what does that change look like from you? We know that David was far from perfect. He was a liar, adulterer, he was a murderer, and yet through his relationship with God, he found a real lasting change. Not a change that made him perfect to everyone else around him, but a change that focused him on God. I pray this for you today as well, that you would be focused on what God wants in your life. So as you make your resolutions this year, as you decide what you want to change in your life this year, let God be the direction in that, and let God dictate your change, because he loves you, and just you, not the perfect you, just you. Be blessed, and I'll see you guys next week.